that productive achievement is a consequence and an expression of healthy self-esteem, not its cause. The cause of authentic self-esteem is psychoepistemological, the rational, reality-directed character of a person's thinking processes. The causal sequence is as follows. A rational psychoepistemology leads to the attainment of self-esteem. The two together lead to achievements. Achievements lead to pride. Failing to understand this causal sequence, many men make the disastrous error of attempting to base their self-esteem on how well they succeed in achieving particular productive goals. However, success of this kind is not necessarily in a man's direct or exclusive control. Since man is neither omniscient nor infallible, and since in many productive endeavors the participation of other people is involved, it is profoundly dangerous to a person's self-esteem to let his sense of personal worth depend on factors beyond his control. The possession of self-esteem does not provide a man with automatic immunity to errors that may have painful emotional consequences. Rationality does not guarantee infallibility. But a healthy self-esteem gives man a great weapon in dealing with errors. Since his own value and the efficacy of his mind are not in doubt, he is free to bring his full intellectual powers and knowledge to the task of identifying facts and dealing with problems. The foundation of his consciousness is secure, so to speak. Conversely, one of the most disastrous consequences of an impaired or deficient self-esteem is that it tends to hamper and undercut the efficiency of a person's thinking processes. It deprives him of the full strength and benefit of his own intelligence. There are many ways in which a deficiency in self-esteem can adversely affect a person's thinking processes. If a man who faces the basic problems of life with an attitude of, "Who am I to know? Who am I to decide?" the man is undercut intellectually at the outset. A mind does not struggle for that which it regards as impossible. If a man feels that his thinking is doomed to failure, he doesn't think, or doesn't think very persistently. If a man sees himself as helpless, ineffectual, his actions will tend to confirm and reinforce his negative self-image, thus setting up a vicious circle. By the same principle, a man who is confident of his efficacy will tend to function efficaciously. A man's self-appraisal has profound motivational consequences for good or for bad. Its most immediate impact is felt in the quality and ambitiousness of his thinking. Many men become, in effect, the psychological prisoners of their own negative self-image. They define themselves as weak or mediocre or unmasculine or cowardly or ineffectual, and their subsequent performance is affected accordingly. The process by which this occurs is subconscious. Most men do not hold their self-image in conscious, conceptual form. While men are capable of acting contrary to their negative self-image, and many men do so at least on some occasions, the factor that tends to prevent them from breaking free is their attitude of resignation toward their own state. This is a particularly tragic error. When a person suffers from low self-esteem and institutes various irrational defenses to protect himself from the knowledge of his deficiency, he necessarily introduces distortions into his thinking. Consider, for example, the case of a man who, lacking authentic self-esteem, attempts to gain a sense of personal value from the image of himself as a big operator in business, a daring and shrewd go-getter who is just one deal away from a fortune. He keeps losing money in one get-rich-quick scheme after another. He is always blind to the evidence that his plans are impractical, always boasting extravagantly, his eyes on nothing but the hypnotically dazzling image of himself as a brilliantly skillful businessman. In order to protect a view of himself that the facts of reality cannot sustain, he severs cognitive contact with reality. He moves from one disaster to another, his sight turned inward, dreading to discover that the vision of himself, which feels like a life-preserver, is in fact a noose choking him to death. There is no way to preserve the clarity of one's thinking so long as there are considerations in one's mind that take precedence over the facts of reality. Pretense, self-deception, role-playing are so much a part of most men's lives that they have virtually lost, if they ever possessed, the knowledge of what it means to have an unreserved respect for the facts of reality. That is, what it means to take reality seriously. They spend most of their lives in the subjective world of their own neurotic creation, then wonder why they feel anxiety and helplessness in the real world. The misery, frustration, and terror that characterize the psychological state of most men testify to two facts. First, that self-esteem is a basic need without which man cannot live the life proper to him, and second, that self-esteem can be achieved only by the consistent exercise of the one faculty that permits man to apprehend reality, his reason. Since self-esteem is a fundamental need of man's consciousness, men who fail to achieve self-esteem strive to fake it. They try to evade its lack and to seek protection from their state of inner dread behind the barricade of a pseudo-self-esteem. Let me explain what pseudo-self-esteem means. It is a non-rational, self-protective device to diminish anxiety and to provide a spurious sense of security, a device to assuage a need of authentic self-esteem while allowing the real causes of its lack to be evaded. A person's pseudo-self-esteem is maintained by two means, essentially. First, by evading, repressing, rationalizing, and otherwise denying ideas and feelings that could affect his self-appraisal adversely. And second, by seeking to derive his sense of efficacy and worth from something other than rationality, some alternative value or virtue which he experiences as less demanding or more easily attainable. This might include such things as doing one's duty, or being financially successful, or sexually attractive. This complex process of self-deception, on which the neurotic builds so much of his life, holds the key to his motivation, to his values, and his goals. To understand the nature and form of a particular man's pseudo-self-esteem is to understand the mainspring of his actions, to know, in effect, what makes him tick. In the psychology of a man of authentic self-value, there is no clash between his recognition of the facts of reality and the preservation of his self-esteem. This is because he bases his self-esteem on his determination to know and to act in accordance with the facts of reality as he understands them. But to the man of pseudo-self-esteem, reality appears as a threat. He feels in effect that it's reality or his self-esteem. This is why a man may be perfectly rational and lucid in an area that does not touch on or threaten his pseudo-self-esteem, and be flagrantly irrational, evasive, defensive, and even stupid in an area which is threatening to his self-appraisal. The process of evasion and repression is not sufficient to provide a neurotic with the illusion of self-esteem. That process is only part of the self-deception he perpetrates. The other part consists of the values he chooses as the means of achieving a sense of personal worth. In the process of choosing values, there is a fundamental difference in principle between the motivation of a man of self-esteem and a man of pseudo-self-esteem. An individual who develops healthily derives intense pleasure and pride from the work of his mind and from the achievements which that work makes possible. Feeling confident of his ability to deal with the facts of reality, he will want a challenging, effortful, creative existence. Feeling confident of his own value, he will be drawn to self-esteem in others. What he will desire most in human relationships is the opportunity to feel admiration. He will want to find persons and achievements he can respect that will give him the pleasure which his own character and achievements can offer others. In the sphere both of work and of human relationships, his base and motor is a firm sense of confidence, of efficacy, and as a consequence, a love for existence, for the fact of being alive. The base and motor of the man without self-esteem is not confidence, but fear. Not to live, but to escape his terror of life is his fundamental goal. Not creativeness, but safety is his ruling desire. And what he seeks from others is not the chance to experience admiration, but an escape from moral values, an escape from moral judgment, a promise to be forgiven, to be accepted, to be taken care of, to be comforted and protected in a terrifying universe. A man's self-esteem or pseudo-self-esteem determines his abstract values, not the specific goals he will seek. The latter proceed from a number of factors such as a person's intelligence, knowledge, premises, and personal context. For instance, a person of high self-esteem will desire intellectually challenging work, but whether he chooses to enter business or science or art depends on narrower, less fundamental considerations. Similarly, a man of pseudo-self-esteem will desire that others protect him from reality, but a variety of factors determine whether he feels more at home among the country club set, or the academic set, or the underworld set. The principle that distinguishes the basic motivation of a man of self-esteem from that of a man of pseudo-self-esteem is the principle of motivation by love versus motivation by fear. Love of self and of existence versus the fear that oneself is unfit for existence. Motivation by confidence versus motivation by terror. To the extent that a man lacks self-esteem, he lives negatively and defensively. When he chooses his particular values and goals, his primary motive is not to afford himself a positive enjoyment of existence, but to defend himself against anxiety, against painful feelings of inadequacy, self-doubt, and guilt. Values chosen in this manner may be termed defense values. A defense value is one motivated by fear and aimed at supporting a pseudo-self-esteem. It is experienced in effect as a means of survival, as a substitute for rationality. It is an anti-anxiety device. Such a value is unhealthy, not necessarily by virtue of its nature, but by virtue of the motivation for choosing it. The value itself may not be irrational. What is irrational is the reason for its selection. Productive work, for instance, is a rational value. But escaping into work as a means of evading one's shortcomings and conflicts is obviously not rational. A significant characteristic of defense values is the unreasoning compulsiveness with which they are usually held. Men of pseudo-self-esteem cling to these values with blind tenacity and fanatical devotion as they would cling to a life-preserver in a stormy sea. Man's greatest fear is not of dying, but of feeling unfit to live. And to escape the agony of that feeling, men will pay any price. They will defy logic, they will sacrifice their practical self-interest, sometimes they will even forfeit their life. With rare exceptions, they will pay any price except the one that could save them. They will not acknowledge the fraudulence of their defenses and work to achieve an authentic self-esteem. They will not accept the responsibility of living as rational beings. No evasion, no defense values, no strategy of self-deception can ever provide a man with a substitute for authentic self-esteem. The sense of efficacy and virtue men long for cannot be purchased by any of the self-frauds men perpetrate. Man needs the conviction that he is right for reality, right in principle, and only a policy of rationality can achieve it. The tragedy of most men's lives comes from their attempts to escape this fact. Self-esteem is the key to man's motivation, by virtue either of its presence or of its absence. And perhaps the most eloquent testimony to the urgency of men's need for self-esteem is the terror that haunts the lives of those who fail to achieve it, the twisted paths along which that terror drives them, and the inevitable wreckage at the end. There is no object of fear more terrifying to man than fear itself, and no fear more terrifying than that for which he knows no object. Yet to live with such fear as a haunting constant of their existence is the fate of countless millions of men and women. It has been the fate of most of the human race. I do not speak of that fear which few men can escape, the fear of dictatorship, of war, of enslavement, of economic collapse, of arbitrary, unpredictable violence. Such fear can be natural and rational, a realistically appropriate response to concrete and tangible dangers. The fear of which I speak occurs without the existence of any apparent perils. Its unique characteristic is that it appears to be causeless. Its victims know only that it has struck them, but they do not know why. Project the kind of terror a man would feel while hanging by a frayed rope over an abyss. Then omit the rope and the abyss. Conceive of a person victimized by such an emotion, not while suspended precariously in space, but while safely at home in his living room or at his office. This is pathological anxiety in its acute stage. Pathological anxiety is a state of dread experienced in the absence of any actual or impending objectively perceivable threat. Pathological anxiety differs from the ordinary fears of everyday life. Ordinary fear is a proportionate and localized reaction to a concrete, external, and immediate danger, such as fear of standing in the path of an oncoming car. It differs also from normal anxiety. Normal anxiety is a feeling of helplessness and apprehension directed, like fear, toward a specific source. But the danger is less immediate than in the case of fear, and the emotion is more anticipatory, such as the feeling that might overcome a person confronted with signs of some serious illness. Normal fear and anxiety vanish when the danger is removed. They are not, in effect, a personality attribute of their possessor. But pathological anxiety is. Pathological anxiety does not always appear in an intense or violent form. Many of its victims know it not as an acute attack of panic or as a chronic sense of dread, but only as an occasional uneasiness, a diffuse sense of nervousness and apprehension, coming and going unpredictably, pursuing some incomprehensible pattern of its own. It can exist on a continuum from faint discomfort to an experience of such agony that many who have known it have sworn they would sooner die than undergo it a second time. In cases of pathological anxiety, the sufferer can give no identity to that which he fears, for he feels afraid of nothing in particular and of everything in general. If he tries to offer some rationalized explanation for his feeling, if he grasps at some sign in the external world to prove he is in danger, his explanations are transparently illogical. He then acts as though that which he fears is not any specific concrete, but reality as such. The percentage of people in the world who suffer from an acute form of mental or emotional disturbance is high. Yet such persons constitute only a very small percentage of the total number of men and women who suffer from pathological anxiety throughout most of their lives, but whose disorder never reaches an alarming degree. These individuals would, in most cases, be regarded by those around them as quite normal. They would not themselves think of questioning their psychological health merely because they are prey to fits of inexplicable, objectless apprehension. These are the persons who, for instance, cannot bear to be alone, or they cannot live without sleeping pills, or drink too much, or they feel a constant need to be amusing and entertain, or flee to too many movies they have no desire to see, and to too many gatherings they have no desire to attend. Or these persons are obsessively concerned with what others think of them, or they long to be emotional dependents or to be depended upon, or they succumb to periodic spells of unaccountable depression, or they run from one meaningless sexual affair to another, or they seek membership in a kind of collective movements that dissolve personal identity and obviate personal responsibility. A vast, anonymous assemblage of men and women who have accepted fear as a built-in, not-to-be-wondered-about fixture of their soul, dreading even to identify that what they feel is fear, or to inquire into the nature of that which they seek to escape. What is the nature and cause of pathological anxiety? To answer this question, one should begin by noting the metaphysical character of this anxiety. The fear seems to be directed at the universe at large, at existence as such, as though implying that to be is to be in mortal danger. The anxious person feels a profound sense of helplessness, of impotence. He feels a sense of shapeless but impending disaster, and often he feels a unique, nameless sense of guilt. And the guilt, too, has a metaphysical quality. He feels wrong as a person, wrong in some fundamental way that is wider than any particular fault or defect he can identify. When a person suffers from this metaphysical kind of dread, the cause does not lie in the external world. It lies within himself. It is not something that reality has done to him. It is something he has done to himself. He carries the threat and the danger within his own consciousness. Pathological anxiety is nature's alarm signal, warning a man that he is in an improper psychological condition, that his relationship to reality is wrong. It is his mind's cry of inefficacy and loss of control. It is a crisis of self-esteem. Whenever a man feels fear, any kind of fear, his response reflects an estimate of some danger to him, some threat to his values. The value being threatened, in the case of pathological anxiety, is the sufferer's ego. A person's ego is his mind, his faculty of awareness, his ability to think. It is the faculty that perceives reality, preserves the inner continuity of his existence, and generates his sense of personal identity. Any threat to a person's ego, anything which he experiences as a danger to his mind's efficacy and control, is a potential source of pathological anxiety. The pain of this anxiety is the most terrible that man can know, because the value at stake is necessarily the most crucial of all his values. In order to deal with existence successfully, to achieve the values and goals his life and well-being require, man needs to strive for an unobstructed cognitive contact with reality. This means that he must maintain a full mental focus, must seek the clearest possible awareness with regard to his actions and concerns, and everything which bears upon them. If a man defaults on the responsibility of this task, the consequences are not merely the failure and defeats he suffers existentially. The deadlier penalty is the consequence for his ego, for his sense of himself. He is sentenced to the feeling that his mind is not a reliable instrument. Whatever a man may have the power to fake, he has no way to fake an efficacy his ego does not possess. If his mind is out of control, it is out of control. No rationalizations, no denials can wipe this fact out of existence or extinguish its psychological consequence, self-distrust. If a person refuses to give thought to issues which he knows, clearly or dimly, require his attention, he may evade the fact of his evasion, but the contradiction between his knowledge and his performance is a fact and cannot be escaped. The fact does not vanish. It is registered in his subconscious, along with the knowledge that the evaded issues have not vanished either. The result is self-distrust. If a man establishes within his consciousness the principle that it is permissible to act with his mind unfocused, that he need not know what he is doing or why, that the difficult need not be thought about, that the painful need not be faced, that the undesirable need not be acknowledged, then this is the secret knowledge about its method of functioning that a man's ego cannot escape. This is the root of self-distrust, self-doubt, and guilt. When one considers the amount of reckless irrationality that most men permit themselves and regard as normal, one does not have to be astonished by the prevalence of so-called causeless fear. If men feel anxiously uncertain of their ability to deal with the facts of existence, they have given themselves ample grounds for their feeling. But pathological anxiety, we must remember, is pathological. That is, it's symptomatic of an abnormal and unhealthy condition. A state of chronic dread is not man's natural condition. The fact that man is neither omniscient, nor omnipotent, nor infallible, nor immortal, does not constitute grounds for his ego to feel overwhelmed by a sense of inefficacy. A rational person does not set his standard of efficacy in opposition to his own nature and to the nature of reality. Neither is man born with any sort of original sin. If a man feels guilty, it is not because he is guilty by nature. Sin is not original, it is originated. The problem of anxiety is psychological, not metaphysical. To the extent that a person indulges in irrational, mind-subverting psychoepistemological policies, he sentences himself to a chronic anticipation of disaster. If he fails to do the thinking his life and concerns require, he cannot escape the awareness that the range of his action exceeds the range of his thought, that challenges and demands will confront him to which he is inadequate. He feels afraid because of the thinking he failed to do, and guilty because of the knowledge that he should have done it. If he acts contrary to his convictions, if he takes actions which he regards as wrong, and or fails to take actions which he regards as right, he comes to experience the feeling not merely that his actions are wrong, but that he is wrong. He is wrong as a person, since a person's deepest sense of himself has its base and origin in his method of psychoepistemological functioning, in the processes by which his mind deals with reality. There is another related reason why a man who acts against his own moral convictions will suffer a sense of impending disaster. Whether the moral values a man accepts are rational or irrational, man cannot escape the knowledge that, in order to deal with reality successfully, in order to live, he needs some sort of moral principles to guide him. Implicit in this knowledge is the awareness that ethical principles are a practical necessity of his life on earth. A corollary of this awareness is his expectation that moral and immoral actions have consequences, even if he cannot always predict them. If he takes actions which he regards as good, he expects to benefit. If he takes actions which he regards as bad, he expects to suffer, although this expectation is often evaded and repressed. Thus, what he is left with, if he betrays his own standards, is the sense of some unknown danger, some unknown retribution, waiting for him ahead. Let us consider an example. A man who has been married for 10 years falls in love with another woman. For a long time, he has resisted identifying his marital dissatisfaction, as well as his feeling for the other woman. But gradually, the repression breaks down, and he finds himself daydreaming about the other woman more and more. He does not think the issue out consciously, he merely lets himself and the problem drift, in the hope that somehow a solution will come to him. One night, accidental circumstances bring him and the other woman together, and he begins an affair with her. He did not intend to begin an affair. His emotions made the decision for him. He feels guilty, and represses the guilt, and continues to drift, evading the other woman's questions about their future. He's still waiting for the solution to come from somewhere. His wife decides to take a trip to visit her parents. As he stands at the airport watching her plane depart, the thought comes to him that if the plane crashed, he would be free and would have no further problems. But the wish is savagely thrust from his mind, along with a sudden burst of hostility toward his wife, which he would never have admitted himself capable of experiencing. Driving home, he suddenly finds that he has difficulty distinguishing the colors of the signal lights. Everything in his field of vision seems to be swimming, and terrible pains appear to be coming from his heart. He feels that he is going to die of a heart attack, but what he is suffering from is a self-esteem attack. The collision is between I must not wish for my wife's death and I did, and do, and will wish for my wife's death. The clash is between a value imperative, engaging his sense of personal worth, his self-esteem or pretense at it, and an emotion, a desire, which contradicts that imperative. Thus, he experiences a crisis of self-esteem. In every instance of pathological anxiety, there is a conflict between some value imperative that is tied in a crucial and profound way to the person's self-appraisal, and some failure, or inadequacy, or action, or emotion, or desire that the person regards as a breach of that imperative. And it is a breach that the person believes expresses or reflects a basic and unalterable fact of his nature. One of the worst consequences of pathological anxiety is its destructive impact on the objectivity and clarity of a person's thinking. When a person doubts the efficacy of his mind, his tendency is to surrender to the guidance of his emotions, since they appear to possess a certainty and authority that his intellect lacks. His emotions are not a substitute for rational cognition at any time, but they are never a less reliable guide than in the midst of an anxiety state. Because the experience of anxiety is so intrinsically painful, neurotics adopt a vast variety of devices and techniques in order to defend themselves against it. Evasion, repression, and rationalization underlie most, if not all, of such defenses. The neurotic can blank out the reality of his objectionable actions. He can repress his unresolved conflicts. He can disown his guilt feelings. He can deny or rationalize his fear. He can seek to distract himself by the frenzied pursuit of various activities. He can avoid the challenge of the unfamiliar. He can elaborate a fantasized self-image to protect him from a self-evaluation he dreads to acknowledge. Often, the repression of the anxiety problem and of the conflicts underlying it results in the formation of other neurotic symptoms. One of these symptoms is particularly worthy of attention in the present context: neurotic depression. Depression, like anxiety, can be normal or pathological. Anxiety is a response to the threatened destruction or loss of a value. Depression is a response to the accomplished destruction or loss of a value. Anxiety is anticipatory and is directed to the future. Depression is directed to the past. Depression is regarded as pathological when it is unrelated to any objective loss, or when its intensity and duration are grossly disproportionate to the loss. Neurotic depression is characterized by despair, passivity, a feeling that action and effort are futile, that nothing is worth doing, and by feelings of self-rejection and self-condemnation. Now, in what manner can depression relate to anxiety? A person is made anxious because of urgent demands, claims, or self-expectations which he feels unable to satisfy. For example, the imperative that he possess certain knowledge and be able to cope with certain responsibilities. He is caught in a conflict. Suppose that he attempts to minimize his anxiety by repressing both the conflict and the related guilt. In its place, on the conscious level of his awareness, he experiences a sense of passivity, futility, and general worthlessness. If one listens closely to his declarations that he is hopeless, that life is hopeless, that he is no good, one can discern another message to be read in his words, and that message is, expect nothing of me, demand nothing of me. Since he is incurably worthless, he is outside the realm of moral expectations. In this manner he resolves the conflict that threatens him with anxiety. In other words, he seeks to anticipate the worst and make it a fait accompli, without coming to grips with his actual problem. Under the guise of renouncing his self-esteem, he is still secretly trying to protect it by neurotic means. This is one of the ways in which depression can be a subconsciously elected alternative to anxiety. Here is another, more indirect pattern. Suppose that a man, rightly or wrongly, accepts certain moral standards as essential criteria of his personal worth, and yet in some crucial respect feels unable to comply with them. Or suppose he desires something desperately which he regards as immoral, and therefore impossible to assert or pursue. The conflict, let us say, is repressed. Since it is repressed, it cannot be resolved. He can neither recheck his standards and discover whether he has made an error, nor can he form any rational policy in regard to the failure or action or desire that is in conflict with his self-expectations. He is left with the oppressive, enervating sense of some nameless, unalterable burden which he is sentenced to carry and live with to the end of his days. He has lost or minimized his anxiety. He may be comparatively free of conscious guilt, but what he experiences instead is despair, an exhausting despair that paralyzes the will to act. He has relinquished the possibility of achieving self-esteem or happiness. To regain his mental health, the depressed person must be willing to experience anxiety. He must be willing to relinquish the comfort of despair and to confront his anxiety-provoking conflicts in order to resolve them and move forward. Anxiety is still a sign of life, of conflict and struggle, and therefore of possible victory. But depression is resignation to defeat. Anxiety and guilt are painful and disruptive of clear objective thinking. But just as physical pain has a crucial survival value, warning a person that his body is in danger, so anxiety and guilt have the same survival value and perform the same function for man's mind and person. Man is free to ignore the warning signals of danger, but the warning is there, in the form of a penalty he cannot escape. And thus, paradoxically, pathological anxiety is at once man's protector and his nemesis. If a man defaults on the responsibility of reason, then his self-betrayed ego becomes its own avenger. A man need not have solved his every psychological problem before he can be free of anxiety and guilt, but it is necessary that he correct the base of his problems, the policy of permitting some other considerations to take precedence over his perception of the facts of reality. The determination to face his problems, to look at reality, is the essential first step in the process by which a man sets himself free of fear and guilt. If and to the extent that this determination is maintained and implemented, psychological liberation will follow. Entailed by the process of achieving self-esteem is a corollary process, that of forming a strong positive sense of personal identity, the sense of being a clearly defined psychological entity. A person's I, his ego, his deepest sense of self, is his faculty of awareness, his capacity to think. Across his lifetime, a person's knowledge grows, his convictions may change, his emotions come and go. But that which knows, judges, and feels, that is the changeless constant within him. To choose to think, to identify the facts of reality, to assume the responsibility of judging what is true or false, right or wrong, is man's basic form of self-assertiveness. It is his acceptance of his own nature as a rational being, his acceptance of the responsibility of intellectual independence, his commitment to the efficacy of his own mind. The hallmark of healthy self-assertiveness in a child is his visible delight in the action of his mind, his desire for the new, the unexplored, the challenging, his refusal to accept on faith the platitudes of his elders. Add to that his insistent use of the word why, his boredom with routine, his hunger for that which will necessitate the fullest exercise of his powers, and thus allow him to achieve and experience the growing pride of self-esteem. Above all, as he grows and develops, such a child is the originator of his own goals. He does not look to others to tell him what will give him enjoyment. He does not expect and does not wish to be told what to do with his time, what to admire, what to pursue, and, years later, what career to select. He is a self-generator, and he is not frightened by, this responsibility. It is this policy, this attitude toward life and toward oneself, that results in the formation of a strong, positive sense of personal identity. The process of healthy growth to psychological maturity rests on a person's acceptance of intellectual responsibility for his own existence. As a human being grows to adulthood, reality confronts him with increasingly more complex challenges at each succeeding stage of his development. The range of thought, knowledge, judgment, and decision-making required of him at the age of 12 is greater than that required at the age of 5. The range required at 20 is greater than that required at 12. At each stage, the responsibility demanded of him involves both cognition and evaluation. He has to acquire a knowledge of facts, and he has to pass value judgments and choose goals. The acceptance of full responsibility for this task is not automatic. The decision to function as an intellectually independent, self-responsible entity is not wired into his brain by nature. It is a challenge to which he responds positively or negatively by choice. Without ever confronting the issue in fully identified terms, the overwhelming majority of men begin retreating very early in life from the challenges of proper conceptual growth, and they die never having actualized more than a small fraction of their potential intelligence. The self-esteem deficiency expressed in the feeling of, "Who am I to know? Who am I to judge? Who am I to decide?" is the consequence of too many retreats from the responsibility of thought and judgment in situations where the person did not have to retreat, where an effort could and should have been made, but was not. Often this policy of self-abdication is wittingly or unwittingly encouraged by parents and other elders who act in such a way as to penalize intellectual independence and initiative on the part of the child. Or the parents and other elders create an impression of such bewildering irrationality that the child simply gives up the effort to understand. By the same token, adults make a positive contribution to the child's proper development to the extent that they encourage and reward independence and self-responsibility. They also act in a consistent, predictable, intelligible manner which supports or implants in the child the conviction that he is living in a knowable world. The fear of relying on the judgment of one's own mind is felt most acutely in the realm of values, because of the direct consequences of one's judgments for one's life and well-being. The evaluative errors that men make affect them personally far more often and far more devastatingly than do most of their cognitive errors. To assume responsibility for choosing the values that guide one's life, the principles by which to act, the goals in which to seek happiness, to make such judgments alone, relying solely upon one's own reason and understanding, is to practice the ultimate form of intellectual independence, the one most dreaded by the overwhelming majority of men. Still another reason why the fear of independence is most intense in the sphere of value judgments is the fact that independence in this area is most likely to bring a person into conflict with other people. Cognitive differences do not necessarily generate personal animosity among people. Value differences commonly do. Therefore, independence in the sphere of value judgments is more demanding psychologically. Since a social form of existence is proper to man, since he has many benefits to derive from living among and dealing with his fellow men, it should be recognized that the desire to have a harmonious relationship with his fellow men is a reasonable one. It becomes unreasonable only if and when a man subordinates his mind and judgment to that desire. In other words, if he places that desire above his perception of reality. For some persons who dread intellectual self-reliance, there is still another motive involved. The process of rational thought and judgment is necessarily a process that a man performs alone. Men can learn from one another, but they cannot share the act of thinking. It is a solitary process, not a social one. There are men who dread independent thought and judgment precisely for this reason. It makes them aware of their separateness as living entities. It makes them aware of the responsibility they must bear for their own existence. It forces them to face their own being, and thus to confront the terror of their own state of non-being. To think, to judge, to choose one's values, is to be individuated, to create a distinct personal identity. But there are many people who, in their deepest emotions, do not want personal identity, however much they may scream to their psychiatrists that they are tormented by a sense of inner emptiness. This psychology represents the most profound form of rebellion against one's nature as man, the attempt to escape the responsibility of being human. Fear of intellectual independence can exist in various degrees of intensity. What are its consequences when it is the dominant element in a person's psychology? There is no escape from the facts of reality, no escape from man's nature or the manner of survival his nature requires. Every living species that possesses awareness can survive only by the guidance of its consciousness. If a person rejects his distinctive form of consciousness, if he decides that thinking is too much effort, or that choosing the values needed to guide his actions is too frightening a responsibility, then, if he wants to survive and to function in the world, he can do so only by means of the minds of others. He can do so only by means of their conclusions, their judgments, their values. He knows, consciously or subconsciously, that he does not know what to do and that knowledge is required to make decisions in the face of the countless alternatives that confront him every day of his life. But others seem to know how to live and function. So the only way to exist, he feels, is to follow their lead and live by their knowledge. They will spare him the effort and the risk. He does not begin by choosing to be an intellectual dependent. He begins by failing to assume the responsibility of thinking and judging on his own. Then he is forced into the position of a dependent. A person of self-esteem deals with reality, with nature, with an objective universe of facts. He holds his mind as his tool of survival and develops his ability to think. But the psychoepistemological dependent lives not in a universe of facts, but a universe of people. People, not facts, are his reality. Reality is reality as perceived by them. It is on them that his consciousness must focus. It is they who he must understand, or please, or placate, or deceive, or maneuver, or manipulate, or obey. To grasp and successfully to satisfy the expectations, conditions, demands, terms, values of others is experienced by him as his deepest, most urgent need. The temporary diminution of his anxiety, which the approval of others offers him, is his substitute for self-esteem. This is the phenomenon that I call social metaphysics. Remember that metaphysics is one's view of the nature of reality. To the psychoepistemological dependent, reality is people. In his thinking, people occupy the place which, in the mind of a rational person, is occupied by reality. Social metaphysics, then, is the psychological syndrome that characterizes a person who holds the minds of other people, not objective reality, as his ultimate frame of reference. Since the social metaphysician's pseudo-self-esteem rests on his ability to deal with the world as perceived by others, his fear of disapproval or condemnation is the fear of being pronounced inadequate to reality, unfit for existence, devoid of personal worth. In order to belong with others, the social metaphysician is willing to belong to them. Since, however, he is seeking a manner of survival improper to man by nature, he condemns himself to chronic insecurity and to a fear of other men that is profoundly humiliating. The nature of his humiliation and fear, however, are seldom identified by him, because he would find it too degrading. Most often he seeks to protect his pseudo-self-esteem by evading the humiliation and rationalizing the fear. Such men, prompted by a fear they dare not acknowledge and so cannot overcome, invent non-existent dangers or grossly exaggerate minor ones, betray their own minds, sell out whatever authentic rationality they possess, and they acquire a vested interest in believing that men are unavoidably evil, that human existence is evil, that the good has no chance on earth. Consider the case of a successful playwright who selects some important theme as the subject of a play, a theme deserving a serious, dramatic presentation, and then realizes that his viewpoint will antagonize a great many people. He decides, therefore, to write the play as a comedy, making good-natured fun of the things he regards as evil, counting on his humor to prevent anyone from taking his view seriously and being offended or antagonized. He does not tell himself that he dreads to be regarded as unfashionable. Instead, he tells himself that serious plays dealing with controversial ideas are non-commercial. But he cannot entirely elude the knowledge that he has sold out the motive that prompted his desire to write the play in the first place. So, he retaliates against his discomforting sense of moral uncleanliness by cursing the stupidity and bad taste of the masses. To the extent that men irrationally surrender to fear, they increase the power of fear over their lives. More and more things acquire the power to invoke fear in them. Their self-confidence diminishes, and their sense of danger grows. With every surrender to the consciousness of others, with every successive betrayal, the social metaphysician's sense of alienation from reality worsens, and his sense of impotence finds confirmation. There are many different types of social metaphysicians. The following traits, however, are common to all: the absence of a firm, unyielding concept of existence, facts, reality, as apart from the judgments, beliefs, opinions, feelings of others; a sense of fundamental helplessness or impotence, a feeling of metaphysical inefficacy; a profound fear of other people, and an implicit belief that other people control that unknowable realm, reality; a pseudo-self-esteem that is tied to and dependent on the responses of the significant others; and a tragic or malevolent sense of life, a belief that the universe is essentially inimical to one's interests. The most fundamental of these traits, the one that makes all the others inevitable, is the absence of a firm, independent sense of objective reality. This is the vacuum that is filled by the consciousness of others, and this is the void that is responsible for that desolate feeling of alienation which is every social metaphysician's chronic torture. It is important to observe that the experience of self-alienation and the feeling of being alienated from the world around one proceed from the same cause, one's default on the responsibility of thinking. The suspension of proper cognitive contact with reality and the suspension of one's ego are a single act. A flight from reality is a flight from self. The most common and easily identifiable type of social metaphysician is the person whose values and view of life are a direct reflection and product of his particular culture or subculture. This is the person who is sometimes described as a conformist. I shall designate this type as the conventional social metaphysician. This is the person who accepts the world and its prevailing values ready-made. His is not to reason why. What is true? What others say is true. What is right? What others believe is right. How should one live? as others live. Why does one work for a living? Because one is supposed to. Why does one get married? Because one is supposed to. Why does one have children? Because one is supposed to. Why does one go to church? Oh, please don't start discussing religion. You might offend someone. This is the person for whom reality is the world as interpreted by the significant others of his social environment. This is the person whose sense of identity and personal worth is a function of his ability to satisfy the values, terms, and expectations of others as he imagines them. This is the type of man without whom no dictatorship could establish itself or remain in existence. He is the man who, in response to advanced signs of danger, closes his eyes. This, lest he be compelled to pass independent value judgments and to recognize that his world is not safe, that action and protest are demanded of him, that the policies and goals of his leaders are evil, and that the significant others are wrong. In the midst of atrocities, he tells himself that the authorities must have their reasons, in order to escape the terror of knowing to whom and to what he has surrendered his existence. It is this same man who, usually when it is too late, will sometimes rebel in hysterical indignation when the atrocities have come too close and cannot be evaded any longer. And this same man may die senselessly in ineffectual protest, screaming at the malevolent omnipotence of the enemy and wondering who or what had made the enemy's power possible. The conventional type is the most blatant and uncomplicated species of social metaphysician. He represents the paradigm case, so to speak, the basic pattern that serves as a reference point with regard to which other species of social metaphysicians may be understood. Another type of social metaphysician is the power seeker. In this type, fear of others is especially pronounced. He finds his fear intolerable, and his reaction is an overriding emotion of hatred. The hatred is aimed at those who invoke his fear. Resentment and hostility are his dominant emotional traits. The power-seeking social metaphysician feels too unsure of his ability to gain the love and approval he desires. His sense of inferiority is overwhelming, and the humiliation of his dependence infuriates him. He longs for an escape from the uncertainty of free-market social metaphysical competition, where he must win men's voluntary esteem. He wants to deceive, to manipulate, to coerce the minds of others, to leave them no choice in the matter. He wants to reach a position where he can command respect, obedience, love. As an example, consider King Frederick Wilhelm of Prussia, who would beat his subjects while shouting at them, "You must not fear me, you must love me." This is the psychology of any dictator from Hitler to Stalin to Khrushchev to Castro to Mao. Fear is the emotion which power-seeking social metaphysicians understand best. The absence of fear in any person they deal with robs them of their delusion of efficacy. Their sense of personal identity tends to evaporate in such a person's presence. Faced with the question, what am I to do with my life, or what will make me happy, the conventional social metaphysician seeks the answer among the standard values of his culture: respectability, financial success, marriage, family, professional competence, and so on. Faced with the question, how am I to make my existence endurable, the power-seeking social metaphysician seeks the answer in aggressive and destructive action aimed at the external object of his fear, other people. Consider next the psychology of what I call the spiritual social metaphysician. This type does not seek to please and placate people in the manner of a conventional social metaphysician, or to gain power over them like a power seeker. This type often does virtually nothing at all. His chief virtue, he proclaims or implies, is that he is too good for this world. He must not be expected to conform to conventional standards. He must not be expected to achieve anything tangible. His friends and acquaintances must love and respect him, not for anything he does, but for what he is. The spiritual social metaphysician's claim to esteem rests on his alleged possession of a superior kind of soul.